Now, the intuitive answer is, of course, we only want to try and recruit 10, right, where 5 are only productive. But the reality is that unless you have a very stringent, very disciplined, very proactive recruitment process and selection process, you will probably have to recruit 100 partners to eventually get 5 that are successful, because they're the facts. We know that we always get this long tail. But on the other hand, though, if you have something that's very disciplined, then you can get away with possibly recruiting 10. So let's talk about specifically recruitment. And there are 2 forms really of recruitment. It's what I call passive and proactive selection. So passive selection is where you really wait until someone comes to you. Proactive selection is where you really go after partners that you want. So let's talk a bit more about passive selection. So it's by far the most common. Probably 90%, 95% of partners in the industry have generally gone to the vendor rather than the other way around, certainly once the vendor is established at least. So it's easy, it's fast, it's often done just via a website. There's a good chance of prepayments, particularly if you're a software vendor or a vendor with a very strong brand. And so resources are made on an ad hoc basis. So the way I characterize this is if you really look back at the history of recruitment, it's what I call deal-based recruiting. It's usually where someone's come up to a field person or someone inside the sales organization, maybe inside the channel organization, and has said, I've got a deal. One of my customers wants to buy whatever you've got to sell. And so they get signed up, they get put in a program, there are some false promises or certainly not enough due diligence done, and so they're managed. And so, but the reality is that this type of recruiting rarely delivers results. In fact, it's actually a drain on resources. It actually creates a whole lot of false perceptions, false starts around what people think they can actually get, and resources are made available where they could be more appropriately deployed. And so you end up with this long tail. I will caution and say, though, that passive selection does work, or certainly in my experience, there's one example where it does work. And that is only when when you're a market leader, not only you're a market leader, but you're in a fast growth segment, and really the play is all around market share. There's maybe not a lot of profitability earlier on. It's really the land, what I call the land grab that's taking place, in which case you cannot be over distributed. But then you need to change your strategy afterwards. So that way, in that instance, passive selection does make a lot of sense, but that's the only example that I'm aware of where it does make sense. On the other hand, you've got what I call proactive selection. So it's much more focusing around the segments that you want to go after, what the customer needs are inside of those segments. It clearly is time-consuming to go and get the best partners. It's certainly hard to engage them because they're the best partners for everybody. We know that there's a consolidation of partners taking place in the marketplace today, and as a result, there are less and less of the better partners taking place. So it's obviously very expensive, and it's the most productive over time. Or it is the most productive over time, but the hardest to make quota in the short term. And so we've seen a number of vendors out there that have recognized this and have tried to find the balance between driving to their their quarterly number, but recognizing too that they don't want to deal with inappropriate or partners that aren't going to deliver them any sustainable growth. And so they're introducing some sort of measurements and some metrics and some compensation aligned to those things with their field teams around making sure that they're engaging with the right partners. So when I talk about proactive partner recruitment, I'm really talking about 4 stages. To a large degree, much of this definitions stuff was covered in the previous webinar. It's defining the segments, defining the customers, looking at their needs, and getting a stronger understanding, having clarity around where growth is going to come from. We did this whole segmentation primer, if you recall, for those that attended, and for those that haven't, you're welcome to come and listen to it. You're going to have some of your own business objectives. You're going to have some of your own shortfalls, whether it be capability, capacity, those sorts of things. You're going to make sure they've got the appropriate relationships in the market, relationships in particular with maybe some supporting or aligned vendors. And there's going to be other objectives. Identification is identification. You can go out and you can buy a Hoover's list. You can use referrals. You can talk to vendors who provide, complementary solutions. You can look at competitive. Leveraging distribution is a very common form of, trying to get some data from them and understand what it is. But really, what I want to spend the rest of this workshop, this webinar on, and where I think the focus needs to be, is around screening, because this is where the disciplines start. Now, some of the other things that we've identified there around, particularly the identification stage, a lot of people know that there's no rocket science there. But how do you, what are the areas where you need to have some discipline around screening? And really, the next webinar we're running on, I think it's December 7th, we mentioned, is really going to talk about how do you go through the sales process and developing compelling value propositions, such that you're going to actually get the interest of these partners. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what screening you do, unless you can really get them over the line, interested and enabled, it doesn't really matter, and it counts for very little. So when we talk about screens, there are 3 screens that we at Channel Enablers believe, and we've seen across the industry, that really help to predict your high-performance partners and help to predict where you can improve the productivity of your existing partners. The first one's the whole product screen, and so that's really in some detail looking at what are all the tangible and intangible items that you need to be able to provide to a customer in the segment that you're going after, such that you have a very compelling joint proposition. The commercial screen is where you get to look at your own objectives and your own shortfalls, whether they be in capacity or capability, and you can start to say, so what else do we need in terms of the sales capability or marketing or technical, maybe operational, maybe some sort of management alignment with the partner. And in relationships, really around the relationship with the segments that you're going after. Do they have the appropriate relationships? And with the complementary or vendors that may also need to be required to be able to complete a solution. Channel marketing, or some sort of headquarters function, is responsible for providing the characteristics, and we're going to give examples of those in a moment. And channel sales is really responsible, so field sales is really responsible for ensuring the criteria are met. This is not just a headquarters function. This is a headquarters function being aligned to the field. Where we've seen that, we've seen substantial increases in productivity of your channel account managers. Productivity being defined as revenue per head. And screening is predictive of where you're going to spend time. So if you're screening a partner in a certain area and they've got shortfalls, well, guess where you're going to spend time with them if they've got shortfalls. And if they've got shortfalls, guess who's going to end up having to fill the bridge? It's going to be yourselves. So when you think about screening, so a typical screen has what we call an attribute, a measure, a quantity, a score, a weighting, and then a weighting score. So the attribute is really I'm going to give some examples of this, but it's really helping you define what it is that you need, whether under whole product, whether it's under commercial or relationship. So what does an ideal partner need to be able to provide? It needs to have a measurement. There's no point putting any attributes that cannot be measured, because you will not be able to drive this down at a field level, and nor will you be able to measure it at a field level. It may have a quantity measure. So an example here is network design skills as the attribute. Certified engineers is the measure, and you've got to have at least 2 people. You then have an ability to provide a score, and so in this case the score was 8 out of 10 because they might have had 3 engineers or 4. And then you have this thing called weighting, and the whole point of weighting is that you want to have one consistent tool, ideally around the world, but countries and regions will vary based on culture, maturity, and scale. And so you've got to have an ability to give them some level of control. So network design skills may not be very important in an emerging market like Vietnam, but might be very important in a mature market like Canada. And so you need to be able to weight accordingly. So 5 would weight it higher, 1 would weight it down. And then you come up with a weighted score. And so this allows you to actually identify and score your partners. It'll also allow you to identify where you've got overall weaknesses across your partner community, but most specifically, it'll allow you to measure the partners that you're targeting and understanding the partners that you're targeting. Well, where are they strong, where are they weak, and can they really help build compelling propositions to those customers? And it also allows you to review your existing partners to identify their gaps and maybe transition them out. And so let me give you 3 examples of actual screens. So this is things that these are screens that have been developed for other clients. We've changed things around to try and make certain that it's not obvious who they are. So the first screen is a commercial screen. So this is where you look at the sales, the marketing, the operational, the management, and the technical capabilities of your partners from your perspective. So you have an attribute, in this case a marketing budget. This is for a distributor. You have so they want to have a marketing budget, particularly in some of the more emerging markets. You have distributors that do have a marketing budget, so you might weight this more highly. In some of the more mature markets, it's less likely, and so you might weight this one down. And so the metric here is they'll match you dollar for dollar, and so the quantity here is 50%. Another example is you may further down a volume licensing competencies, third from the bottom. So you want to show that they've got a proven system to manage their software licenses. So there's not a quantity measure, but you want them to be able to demonstrate that. Efficiency coming back up again. Efficient sell-through and forecasting and reporting delivered within 5 days. The measurement's 5 days. If they don't have these things, this is predictive of where you're going to spend time with them, whether it's before you recruit them, right, or after you've recruited them. So this is an example of a whole product screen. So the whole product screen is really focusing on what are the things that you need to be able to deliver, both tangible and intangible, and need to be visible to a customer for them to want to make a purchasing decision or be comfortable with the purchasing decision. And so this is really a VAR who you're looking for to sell into the legal industry. So again, they've got to have legal clients, because the first thing that a legal customer is going to ask is what other legal firms have you sold to? So 10 is the measurement. They need to have a paralegal on staff because they've got to be able to provide some legal training. So they're looking for one person. So again, you'll see you have a whole series of attributes. It's our experience that where you've got very complex sales, you may have up to 50 or 60 attributes across the 3 different screens. Where you're in a less complex or commoditized or tertiary space, it might be as few as 15 to 20. And the third example is a relationship screen. So this is where you're really looking at the relationship with the marketplace and with complementary vendors. And this is just for a broad-based reseller. So in this case, the attribute was around customer base. It was around getting 60% of the revenue from the major market segments that are important to you. And so again, the measurement is 60%. You want to have a certain activity in your customer base, 1,000 active customers. It's not worth targeting partners that have less than that, because they're not going to give you the volume that you're looking for. And so you can go on and see there are many other examples. As I said, you can get copies of this on the website, so you can look at these in a little more detail. I'd be happy to talk more about it. So what I've spoken principally about is the whole process of selecting partners, reviewing existing partners. The reality is that as you select partners, there'll be those that you want to recruit and are obvious. But there are those that are also, inside of your existing partner community. There'll be some that will also be obvious. There'll be some that are clearly ones that you don't want to engage with, that are going to be at the very end of your tail. But there will be some in the middle that you're not quite sure. And so what I'd like to do is introduce Joby now. Is going to talk about some ideas and some thoughts on really how to try and manage some of those partners and identify ways to try and make them more productive.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Braham. So I kind of like to start off with a little story. So earlier this year, we attended a conference, and one of the vendor speakers kind of casually mentioned that they had recently just fired their low-performing partners. It was, like I said, a casual comment, but the room instantly was abuzz with everybody asking each other, boy, would you do that? Have you ever thought of that? And so it was entertaining to hear all the varying opinions. I think at the end, though, everyone agreed it made sense, but many also said they just couldn't imagine giving up those one-off deals that some of those low-performing partners bring in on occasion. So when we got back, we talked a lot about it, and so we posed some questions across several LinkedIn groups. And what we were hoping was to get some vendor and partner thoughts on the topic. And so hopefully some of you might have seen that and maybe even responded. If you did, thank you. We took the time to aggregate all the feedback we heard, and we kind of narrowed it down to just a few reasons on why people were against firing these low performers, and then why some were thought that it made a lot of sense. If you go to the next slide there, Braham.